Tonight, the image is simple, brutal, and easy to misunderstand. American warplanes hit military targets on Iran's Kharg Island, and within minutes, the official message coming out of Washington was clear. This was strength, control, dominance. Another successful strike, another pressure point, another step toward breaking Iran's war machine. But Kharg Island is not just another target. Kharg is one of the most sensitive pieces of terrain in the entire Middle East. It sits at the intersection of oil, war, state survival, and global economic fear. It is not important because of its size. It is important because of what flows through it, what it funds, and what happens to the world when that flow is threatened. So when the United States says it obliterated military targets there but stopped short of destroying the oil infrastructure itself, that is not a sign that this war is comfortably under control. It may be a sign that Washington knows exactly how dangerous the next step would be, and that is why this moment matters. Because the official story says America is tightening the screws on Iran while carefully avoiding a wider catastrophe. But the real story may be far darker. The real story may be that Washington is now operating inside a narrow corridor where every move meant to force Iranian retreat also increases the risk of regional blowback, shipping paralysis, oil shock, and a conflict that spreads not because either side wants total war, but because neither side can afford to look weak. This may not be the beginning of the end, it may be the beginning of the expensive phase, the uncontrollable phase, the phase where the battlefield stops being just missile sites and command centers and starts becoming fuel prices, tanker routes, insurance markets, allied capitals, and household budgets around the world. To understand why, we need to rewind for a moment. This war was sold from the start as a campaign of overwhelming force. The White House framed Operation Epic Fury as decisive action to crush Iranian military capabilities, destroy the regime's offensive tools, and restore deterrence. The message was that Iran would be hit so hard, so fast, and so precisely that it would lose the ability to escalate in any meaningful way. America would seize the initiative, Iran would be forced into weakness. The region, after a violent shock, would stabilize under pressure. That was the promise. But wars in the Gulf almost never stay inside the neat boundaries drawn by press briefings. They leak, they spread sideways. They infect trade, diplomacy, shipping, and the fragile calculations of neighbouring states. And over the last 2 weeks, that is exactly what has happened. The Strait of Hormuz became not just a talking point, but a live threat to global energy flows. Iraq became more unstable. American facilities and interests faced rising danger. Regional actors began reading the conflict not as a contained strike campaign, but as a widening contest over who can impose intolerable costs on whom. That is the key shift. This is no longer just about whether the United States can destroy more Iranian targets. Of course it can. The American military advantage is overwhelming in conventional terms. The deeper question is whether military superiority can produce strategic control once the conflict enters the economic bloodstream of the region. Once tankers hesitate, once insurers panic, once oil traders start pricing fear instead of supply, once allied governments begin wondering whether American escalation is protecting them or painting targets on their backs, that is where Kharg Island enters the story. Kharg is not some symbolic outpost. It is one of the central arteries of Iran's oil export system. It is a node of revenue, leverage, and regime endurance. Hitting military targets there sends a message far beyond the island itself. It says that the United States can now touch some of the most sensitive foundations of Iran's war economy. But the fact that the strike stopped short of directly destroying the oil infrastructure sends a second message, and this one may be even more revealing. It says Washington is trying to walk up to the edge of an energy catastrophe without stepping over it. And that is not a position of comfort. That is a position of tension. Because once you attack the military skin wrapped around a critical oil nerve center, everyone involved understands what is being implied. Iran understands. The Gulf states understand. The oil market understands. The shipping industry understands. The question is no longer whether energy infrastructure is part of the war. The question is how long it stays just outside the crosshairs. That ambiguity may be deliberate. It may be designed to terrify Tehran into restraint, but ambiguity cuts both ways. Iran can read it as a warning. It can also read it as proof that America is afraid of the consequences of finishing the job. And if Tehran believes Washington wants maximum pressure without maximum economic fallout, then Iran has every incentive to internationalize the pain, not by defeating the United States in a direct military sense, but by making the price of continued war too high for everyone else. That is the hidden logic of Gulf escalation. Iran does not need to sink the U.S. Navy. It does not need to win air superiority. It does not need to match American firepower target for target. It only needs to keep the region unsafe enough, volatile enough, and expensive enough that the burden of war spills outward. It only needs to keep the Strait of Hormuz in a state of chronic threat. It only needs the market to believe that any tanker, any terminal, any offshore field, any allied capital could be next. And when that happens, the battlefield changes completely. You stop measuring escalation by how many launches were destroyed or how many facilities were hit. You start measuring it by lost barrels, delayed cargoes, insurance premiums, and political panic. War becomes a tax on everyone. That is why the attack on Kharg may be more important than some much larger strikes elsewhere. Not because it did the most damage, but because it illuminated the real centre of gravity. The centre of gravity is no longer just Iranian military capacity. It is the gap between America's military dominance and its ability to control the second-order consequences of using that dominance near the world's most sensitive energy choke point. And now the second layer of this crisis is becoming visible. As Washington celebrated the strike, the United States also moved to reinforce the region with additional Marines and the amphibious assault ship U.S Tripoli. Officially, that can be explained as prudent force protection, contingency planning, and readiness. In military terms, that makes sense. If embassies, bases, evacuation routes, or shipping lanes are under growing threat, you reinforce. That is standard logic. But politically and strategically, it sends a more complicated signal. Because if the campaign were as stable and controlled as the official story suggests, why is Washington still adding muscle, mobility, and rapid response capacity? Why does a supposedly successful pressure campaign now require a thicker defensive shell? Why is the posture becoming heavier if victory is so close? The answer may be that the administration understands something it does not want to say too plainly. Wars like this rarely collapse in a straight line. They metastasize. You hit one pressure point and retaliation emerges somewhere else. You secure one asset and another one becomes vulnerable. You degrade missile launchers and the enemy shifts toward militias, drones, sabotage, proxy harassment, or attacks on energy infrastructure linked to U.S. partners. And that appears to be exactly the concern now. The strike on the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad, the growing alerts around Iran-aligned groups, and the broader pattern of threats to American interests all point to a battlefield expanding beyond Iran's borders. This matters because Iraq, the Gulf monarchies, shipping lanes, and diplomatic compounds are not peripheral to the conflict. They are how the conflict escapes containment. And once it escapes containment, America's allies face an ugly dilemma. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Bahrain, Qatar, and others all depend in different ways on the idea that the Gulf can remain economically functional even during crisis. But that assumption begins to crack when energy facilities, offshore fields, tankers, and major ports are dragged into the psychology of war. Even states that support pressure on Iran do not want to become the invoice address for the consequences. They do not want to host bases, cooperate quietly with Washington, and then discover that their own infrastructure, their own cities, or their own economic lifelines are now part of the retaliation map. This is where the official narrative starts to collide with the regional reality. Washington wants to project resolve. Iran wants to prove that resolve has a price. The Gulf states want deterrence without devastation. The market wants reassurance but keeps seeing signals of fragility. And ordinary people across the world, most of whom could not locate Kharg Island on a map, may end up paying for all of it anyway. Because once oil moves above the psychological threshold and stays there, the story changes everywhere. Fuel gets more expensive. Shipping costs rise. Airlines feel pressure. Freight passes through supply chains like a fever. Inflation, which governments insist is under control, begins to feel alive again. Import-dependent economies in Asia feel it fast. Europe feels it through energy anxiety and transport costs. Emerging markets feel it through currency and balance of payment stress. Consumers feel it not as geopolitics, but as a harder month, a tighter budget, an extra layer of uncertainty. And that may be the most devastating part of this entire story. The people who never voted for this war, never planned it, never briefed it, and never appeared at the podium may be the ones who absorb its most durable costs. This is why the Kharg strike is more than a tactical event. It is a revelation. It reveals the contradiction at the center of America's approach. Washington wants to cripple Iran's war financing without detonating the energy system. It wants to threaten the oil artery without severing it. It wants escalation dominance without escalation fallout. It wants the fear generated by proximity to disaster without the disaster itself. Sometimes states do manage that balancing act, but history suggests it is a dangerous fantasy, especially in the Gulf, because once both sides begin operating around vital energy architecture, miscalculation stops being an abstract risk and becomes the operating environment. One more strike, one more retaliatory volley, one misidentified vessel, one proxy attack that goes too far, one allied facility hit harder than expected, one insurance retreat, one naval incident in a narrow passage of water. That is all it takes for a managed escalation to become an uncontrolled spiral. And that spiral would not look dramatic at first, it would look administrative. Rerouted ships, suspended sailings, higher premiums, emergency meetings, released reserves, calm official statements, quiet private panic. Then suddenly the calm statements stop sounding convincing and the market begins to believe the disruption is not temporary. That is when the real damage begins, because the wider chessboard here is enormous. China, India, Japan, South Korea, Europe, Gulf producers, international shipping giants, insurers, energy traders, central banks and political leaders everywhere are now watching the same narrow strip of water and asking the same question: can this still be contained? The United States wants the answer to be yes. Iran wants the answer to be no, or at least not cheaply. And the rest of the world is trapped between those two ambitions. That is why this conflict may become bigger than the headlines suggest, not because of some dramatic instant collapse, but because the incentives are becoming more dangerous. America has reason to keep pressing while it believes momentum is on its side. Iran has reason to widen the cost map while it cannot match American power head-on. Regional actors have reason to hedge, conceal, reposition and protect themselves. Markets have reason to assume the worst before the worst fully arrives. This is how regional wars become global economic events. So where does this go next? There are two plausible paths and both are ugly. The first is controlled de-escalation. In that version, Washington continues selective strikes but avoids a direct hit on major oil infrastructure. Iran retaliates but below the threshold that would trigger full-scale attacks on energy terminals or a permanent shutdown of shipping lanes. Some commercial transit resumes. Back-channel messages intensify. Both sides quietly look for a ceiling. America claims deterrence worked. Iran claims resistance imposed limits. The market remains shaken, but the worst is avoided. That path is possible, but it requires discipline, restraint, and luck from actors who are currently operating under humiliation, pressure, and maximalist rhetoric. That is a fragile formula. The second path is the one no one officially wants, but many may be drifting toward anyway. In that version, the line around oil infrastructure does not hold. Kharg becomes a prelude instead of a warning. Iran or its aligned networks hit US-linked energy assets harder, or pressure in Hormuz intensifies to the point that commerce effectively freezes. Washington responds with broader targeting. Regional governments are pulled in deeper. Insurance and shipping seize up further. Energy prices surge again. The war stops being something viewers watch on a screen and starts showing up in the cost structure of daily life across continents. That path is not guaranteed. But tonight it is no longer a fringe possibility. It is a real scenario embedded in the logic of the current escalation. And that is the darkest truth hiding beneath the triumphal language around the Kharg strike. The official story says this proves control. The deeper story may be that it proves how narrow the margin for control really is. Because if America were fully in command of the escalation ladder, it would not need to threaten the oil nerve center without touching it. It would not need to reinforce the region while insisting the campaign is proceeding exactly as planned. It would not be operating inside this strange contradiction where every show of force also advertises the fragility of the system surrounding the war. Kharg Island matters because it strips away the illusion. It shows that this conflict is no longer just about destroying Iranian capabilities. It is about whether the United States can impose pain faster than Iran can spread pain outward. It is about whether the Gulf remains a strategic theatre or becomes a global bill. It is about whether Washington can keep the war near the edge of the oil system without eventually falling into it. And if it cannot, then the consequences will not stay in the Middle East. They will move through ports, prices, politics, and public anger. They will test alliances. They will strain governments. They will reorder calculations from New Delhi to Berlin to Tokyo to Washington itself. Because when the world's most sensitive energy artery becomes part of a live war zone, there is no such thing as a local shock. There is only the illusion of distance. So the questions tonight are brutal. If the United States is truly in control, why does the battlefield keep getting wider instead of narrower? If Kharg was meant as a warning, why does it look so much like the opening move of a more dangerous economic war? And if the final cost of this conflict is paid in oil, inflation, disrupted trade, and public pain far from the front lines, then who is really winning it all?